Howdy, welcome to Moonlight Less Than Moonlight. I'm Justin, and today we'll be talking about Mariama J Lockington's Upon Moving Back to Michigan, I Plant a Garden and Become Reacquainted with My Sister, which was published in issue 20 of Muzzle. Lockington, in her own words, is, quote, an author, nonprofit educator, and transracial adoptee who calls many places home. Her debut middle grade novel, For Black Girls Like Me, is out now from Farrar, Straus & Giroux Books for young readers. For Black Girls Like Me is a Junior Library Guild selection and has earned 5-star reviews from Publishers Weekly, Book Page, School Library Journal, Shelf Awareness, and Booklist. Mariama is also the author of the poetry chapbook The Lucky Daughter, Damaged Goods Press, 2017, and her second middle grade novel, In the Key of Us, is forthcoming in 2022. A quick content warning for racist language in the poem, and now I'll give you a moment to read. Welcome back. Now, let's read through it again. There are 2 little notes about the title to check off before we hit a bigger topic, it being all lowercase and the hyphen in reacquainted. If you think about the times you might have texted someone or made a social media post in all lowercase, it's commonly to express a specific tone, ironic, shocked, restrained anger. In my head, I hear distance in the title's lowercases. Like the speaker in the poem, the title is trying to keep his distance from the events they talk about, which is why I noted the hyphen in reacquainted. It's atypical to include, and it comes across as a way to further separate the speaker from their sister. It emphasizes the new beginning of their relationship while physically separating this new beginning from the actual act of becoming acquainted. Which brings us to the important note, which is that upon moving back to Michigan, I plant a garden and become reacquainted with my sister, is an occasional poem. What is an occasional poem? It is, literally, a poem for an occasion. In this case, it is upon moving back to Michigan, but you probably know a few occasional poems already. If you've seen 4 Weddings and a Funeral, you've heard W.H. Auden's Funeral Blues.
Silence the pianos and with muffled drum, bring out the coffin. Let the mourners come.
If you were around for Obama's first inauguration, you've heard Elizabeth Alexander's Praise Song for the Day.
Praise song for struggle. Praise song for the day. Praise song for every hand-lettered sign. The figuring it out at kitchen tables.
What's important about this is the questions it forces us to think about as we read the poem, and I hope you'll bear with me as I build up to those questions. In the intro to her book on occasional poetry, Professor Marian Zwirling Sugano lays out the stakes for engaging it. Occasionals began as rhetorical devices in ancient Greece, recognized as possessing such significant political power that the philosopher Plato declared in the Republic that the ideal city would banish poetry. During the Renaissance, occasionals would become tools to court rich and powerful patrons, and eventually what Sugano calls almost a thinking aloud in verse, characterized by its adaptability and availability to the caprice of circumstance. As that social and political order fell off, with the death of patronage and the birth of the general reader through mass literacy, poets were left in a wonky space where they were no longer obligated to versify over specific events, and thus there was space for occasionals to expand beyond the occasion. Today this is felt, Sugano says, in the still present challenge posed most explicitly by modernism. Quote, art is antithetical to the intellectual and social struggles of our time, end quote. It leads us to ask then, what is poetry's relationship to its occasion, and what does it mean to read a poem within the context of its occasion? While we're obviously not answering these questions here, they can be the nagging voices in the back of our heads as we think about the speaker's relationship to their garden and their sister within the poem. The speaker sets the scene with the description of a garden under attack. Notably, what's attacking the garden is not a singular force nor of a single origin. There are insects which are visible and their consequences in the basil. There are invisible animals taking entire leaves. There is the tomato vine which, instead of being diminished, is actually expanding in a dangerous way. There is the tomatoes which refuse to grow. Despite seemingly having just returned to Michigan upon moving back, and planted it, the garden already finds itself in a state of neglect, or taken over. There's this uncomfortable warp of time where tomato vines grow extensively and tomatoes not at all, quote-unquote, refusing to blush. With the cut to the sister in the next stanza, the relationship between garden and sister is hinted at. Historically, blushing is considered a sign of youth, good health, and being in one's sexual prime. So here we have a tomato that quote-unquote, refuses to blush, and the speaker's 14-year-old sister, quote-unquote, bleaching the down of their pubic hair. This juxtaposition is suggestive, implying a connection between the juvenile state of the tomatoes in the falling apart garden and the sister's whitening of her pubic hair. It's worth pointing out that the relationship between black people and bleaching is complex, and has been called the bleaching syndrome by sociologist Ronald E. Hall. Light skin, he writes, although light hair is worth mentioning too, continues to be the ideal because it's the one preferred by the dominant group, whites. To some extent, both the sister and the tomato are denying their natural growth, which explains why the sister takes the burn as punishment, quote-unquote. In rejecting herself, she sees herself as the problem, and so the burning is seen as self-punishment for blackness. This adoption of whiteness continues with her putting on a Lilly Pulitzer dress, which the speaker accurately describes as, quote, of Florida neon sweet tea, sweating palm trees, end quote. Off the bat, the dress is heavy with bitter irony. Sweet tea has direct roots to slavery. Sugar was a major cash crop for plantations throughout the Americas, and is considered by Professor Khalil Gibran Muhammad to be what cemented slavery in the U.S. economy prior to cotton, though Louisiana would profit extensively off sugarcane. In a second bitter twist, while Florida and Louisiana are humid subtropical climates presumably fitting for a neon dress, Michigan is a humid continental climate. The dress is an aspirational lie. This is pretty much confirmed by the history of the Lilly Pulitzer brand, which was started by the New York socialite of the same name. Lilly Pulitzer designed the iconic patterns on screen right now to hide juice stains, so the story goes. Her designs would go on to become what the Museum of Lifestyle and Fashion History calls, quote-unquote, the unofficial uniform of the wealthy. Her story is actually pretty interesting, and I'll be linking a Town & Country magazine article in the description below. But regarding the poem, it becomes clear that the dress is the summation of the historical and contemporary violences committed on black bodies, with specific attention to black women's bodies here. This history becomes the only interaction between the speaker and the sister. The speaker sees the dress, and then the sister tells her that the quote-unquote white boy she loves says she's, quote, not like those other cotton pickers, end quote, while seeking approval. At this point, the hyphen that stands between the re and the acquainted seems more like a wall preventing familiarity than a bridge between them. Turning away from the sister, neither approving of nor dismissing her feelings, the speaker then turns back to the former hope that, quote, I thought maybe if I got my hands dirty here, if I went back to the ground and blessed my skin with its grubs, earthworms, and yarrow, it would teach me how to seedling again, that it would give me a way to mourn all these endings, to believe in our survival, to relearn the smell of blood in the rain as amniotic fluid, urgent arrival. This pivot to visions of the garden creates a sharp juxtaposition between the speaker as someone trying to cultivate a garden, to seedling again and believe in our survival, and the white boy's image of black people as cotton pickers. It mocks the possibility of mourning by turning the self-sustaining work of gardening into a mimicry of slavery, and thus reconfirms the presence of racial injustice in a deeply physical way. A way so physical that it changes the smell of rain into a parallel of new birth, as first blood and amniotic fluid, two fluids that come out alongside the baby during childbirth. Yet neither in the dirtying of hands over the garden, nor over the race-based abuse of the speaker's sister, is there a blessing of blackness or an ending to history's weight. Returning to the garden, we see the tomato, paralleling the sister and the speaker's telling, green as the vine, dropped and rotted in its small carcass. Not only did they refuse to blush, but they refused to be born. In a sense, neither the tomato nor the speaker's sister were allowed a moment of uninjured existence. But I want to complicate this further. Google black people blush, and as of the day this video is published, you'll find someone asking on Quora, do black people blush? This is not just an internet issue. As Dr. Felix Idiakonoteahulu notes, white doctors often doubt the existence of varicose veins, let alone blushes, on black skin. You must know what to look for. This can have serious medical consequences, since Dr. Konoteahulu notes, the skin is often the gateway into something more profound. But it also dehumanizes and should have us reevaluating how we saw this parallel between the speaker's sister and the tomato refusing to blush. Perhaps, we might imagine, the sister herself is completely aware of what the speaker is saying and was seeking approval as a way to quote-unquote believe in our survival. Does she not take the bleach burning as her quote-unquote punishment? How can you punish yourself if you're not conscious of what you think you're guilty of? Food for thought as we hear the speaker ask, how can I teach her she is healing root? That he will never see her as I do, when even here in the garden little deaths mock our safety. So the speaker, once drawing us towards seeing her as a tomato on a vine, is pulling us towards, quote-unquote, ginger, sweet potato, black cumin. Instead of a berry openly on a vine, yes, tomatoes are berries, weirdly enough, we are told to look underground, towards the tubers, nutrient storage units. What this does is draw us towards a semi-tragic answer to the speaker's next question. What are we allowed to grow with our black girl magic? As she is trying to untangle this garden where the weeds have taken over, we might want to think of the famous novella by Voltaire, Candide. Candide is the story of a young prince who, alongside his professor, Dr. Pangloss, undergoes a grimdark Forrest Gump story. He not only falls from grace, but experiences every possible suffering, from slavery to attempted murder to vast wealth quickly gained and lost at sea. As the young Candide grieves and mourns, Pangloss insists that they live in the best of all possible worlds. His absurd optimism is so famous, in fact, that the word Panglossian exists to describe this attitude. Also famously, the novella ends with Candide and company on a small farm. Pangloss philosophizes about the dangers of grandeur, listing off historical figures destroyed by hubris, only to be cut off by Candide, who says, "We must cultivate our garden." In this practical humanism, we see an inkling of what the speaker finds in the healing roots, a workaday cultivation of the self and the world. Yet, to go further, to return to the occasional, Candide seemingly rejects philosophizing over history. The occasional, though, and this poem in particular, are fairly tied to being read, quote-unquote, within the context of its occasion. Roots are often metaphorical for historical ties, think family trees, and the Lily Pulitzer dress expresses a physical concentration of historical injustice and its continuation today. The poem's occasion is one of return, of performing an action with historically weighty parallels, of coming back to one's own family. Now, I don't have an answer here, and I don't think the poem wants to give one, but I want to leave you with a clip from Maya Angelou's "And Still I Rise," which stands flush against Lockington's poem. It's a celebration of black endurance, and it gives a vision of quote-unquote black girl magic that should be kept in mind.
Out of the huts of history's shame I rise. Up from a past rooted in pain, I rise. A black ocean leaping and wide, welling and swelling and bearing in the tide. Leaving behind nights of terror and fear, I rise. Into a daybreak miraculously clear, I rise. Bringing the gifts that my ancestors gave. I am the hope and the dream of the slave. And so, wow, there I go.
So that's some thoughts on Mariama J Lockington's "Upon moving back to Michigan, I plant a garden and become reacquainted with my sister." What were your thoughts? Do you agree with my reading? Disagree? What are your favorite lines? If you enjoy the video, like and subscribe while you're down there, leaving your thoughts. And don't forget to check the description for links to my sources and to Lockington's site, where you can read even more of her work. Until next time, thanks for sticking around.